So in the interim, everyone, thank you for sticking with us through this technical difficulty. We announced a save the date for elementary families, and that's what we're working toward right now. So for all of you who are tuned in, you likely know this. Thank you, Wendy, for making me the host. For all of you that are tuned in, you likely know this, but we have sent out a survey, and that survey helps us to see both what you plan on doing as families. And for lower elementary families, we're asking that families fill out that survey by today at 10 p.m. And then for anyone who we haven't heard from in the lower elementary, we'll start our outreach and phone calls tomorrow. We did send out a survey in December, and we were able to get a hold of every single student and family. So that's still our expectation for this today. And then to go over safety standards, I'll pass it along to Wendy Fisher, who will share with us some of the developments in benchmarks.
Hi, everybody. So we've come up with some baseline safety standards that we plan to be able to meet prior to bringing more in-person learning on site. This work has been done with our COVID advisory group and also with a subset of that group, our benchmarks committee. And we will continuously measure these safety standards to make sure that we're in compliance with the safety guidelines that we've set to feel great about the students and our adults feeling like they can do their work and learning in an environment that is not harmful to their health. We also have protocols for how we support safe practices in our classrooms and the common spaces and our outdoor environments. And we'll continuously revise these as we live together and work together on site and see what's working and what needs to be tightened up. We also have data points to measure that help us decide if after moving to in-person learning, we need to take a pause and move back into distance learning in order to ensure that everyone is safe. So this is hard to read and it will be shared with you soon. This is a set of baselines that give us the information that we need as we think about any opportunity that we would take to pause. These revisions are a part of the most recently revised guidelines from the Minnesota Department of Health. And these guides and the following slides are being reviewed by faculty, the COVID advisory group, and shown to the school board as we prepare to publish them to you next week. So we want to make sure our stakeholder groups get a chance to weigh in on these. But essentially it's MDH guidance, it's looking at community spread of COVID, it's taking information from what's happening on site, and then our assessments as to how well our students are able to follow our safety guidelines. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I'm not looking. So again, there are protocols that we plan to follow that maintain our baseline safety and health. And then the next slide shows us how we're doing this. So we've created a form that can be filled out very quickly by going into a classroom and looking at how students are complying with both the distancing and mask wearing. And you just, any one of the administrators, any classroom guide, any special ed person, anyone who's observing can just scan their phone with the QR code that's hanging outside the classroom, type in or press the buttons that tell us how many students are in compliance and not compliance. And then all of that data is funneled into a weekly report where we can see how much, whether we're hitting our 80% compliance mark in both of these important ways that we make sure that the students and the adults are safe on site. And then another tool that we are using is our classroom audit, where we're asking our classroom teams to fill this out every Friday to get more of a qualitative sense of the culture and how safe they're feeling and how well they think their students are doing. What's great is that we can look at both of these quantitative and qualitative data points, and we can get a sense of both what's the temperature of emotion and what are the actual facts on the ground as to how well we're doing. Now, Jean's going to talk about how this actually looks when the students are learning virtually and when they're learning in person on site.
Thanks, Wendy. Will you or Sam let me know if I start to sound robotic, and I will turn my video off?
Sounds good. Sounds like
Absolutely. Even Jean, I would suggest turn your video off now and we will just roll with the presentation.
Great idea, Sam.
Thanks, Jean.
Can you go to the next slide, please? So we know from feedback from both families and educators that it is really important to keep learning communities together. We know that when we come back with some students doing in-person learning and virtual learning, that we will continue to have community meetings that involve both groups of students. We know that we will provide opportunity for both time during the day to do things together, to collaborate on work, listen to read aloud, and also some time for social connection. The interesting thing as we got to get feedback from families is that classrooms can look different. Not only can they look different about how many students are interested in in-person and virtual now, but we have additional entry points through the rest of the year that could significantly change numbers in classrooms. So we wanted to make sure that within our model that we had the flexibility for individual classrooms to meet their unique needs and also to be able to shift as those numbers might change. So we have a lot of flexibility within this model and different ways that guides and assistants can deliver lessons. And one of them is really geared to having more students in person and one geared to having more virtual learners. If you have more students in person, there would be more synchronous live streaming, as opposed to if you had a more equal split. It could be that the guide and the assistant designate morning and afternoon for distance and virtual and flip-flop in the middle of the day. But this allows for a lot of independence, both within individual classrooms and as our numbers shift and change. Sam?
Are you ready for, oh, sorry, Jean. give me a reading rainbow style ping or an ahem.
So we have been busy this week looking at, well, how are we going to do this? How do you live stream a Montessori lesson? And we have had people working on the technology and guides that have been coming in and trying out the technology to let us know what works or what doesn't work for them. We know that being able to hear students and students being able to hear guides is really important and has been a challenge as we're doing virtual learning. So we are trying different microphones in order to be able to clearly be heard and to hear students. So these are just some examples of some of the different setups that we have had in the classrooms. We've also started looking at our classrooms, Sam, to look at how do we set up a classroom that has both, follows all the safety precautions and allows students to come in and work in a prepared Montessori environment.
Sam, there we go.
So what would this look like for a student? And we have some pictures so we can show you some possibilities.
And I suppose just before I went to the pictures, Jean, I just switched to the slide that has some of the distance guidelines. And I know one common question that we might get an answer into right here is that the Department of Education and Department of Health in the state of Minnesota have identified that for all schools now as of February 17th, but in particular since December for elementary schools, 3 feet minimum between students is the social distancing guideline that is asked, and that I'll just have my slide back up in a moment here. And that there we go. Jean and Wendy, can you?
Thumbs up.
Okay, great. So that minimum social distancing guideline of 3 feet, I think, is something that that folks will hear a little bit more about in a moment also, but I just wanted to point that out as a line here. I'll go to the next slide. How about that, Jean?
Well, the slide you're on is perfect, Sam. So as Sam said, the 3-foot minimum between students. And if you look at this picture, this is an example of how a guide has gone in and created both work areas that follow the 3-foot minimum and also have walking paths. So students know where to walk as they're moving through the classroom. There are different ways that you can set up classrooms with and staying within the 3-foot distances. And I have to say, I've seen some pretty creative setups already. We do know that there is plenty of room for all students in our classrooms while keeping the 3-foot distance. Here's some more examples of different ways that you can envision a classroom with that 3-foot distance. By utilizing both ends of a long table, there are the small tables that we call chowkies set up in an arrangement that would both keep students separate and allow them to collaborate on work. And in the bottom right, you will see a picture of a lesson table, which would allow, I think that 7 or 8 students to both be socially distanced and be in an in-person lesson.
All right, thanks, Jean.
You're welcome.
So at the danger of overcoming my own bandwidth challenges, I'm going to keep streaming my video while we move on to some questions from the community. So we've gathered the following questions that are typed out on slides, and then I see we have, I think, 7 or 8 questions in the Q&A that we'll answer live. So as we go through these next few questions, I think Jean and then Wendy and then myself will answer these ones that we've gathered, and then we'll answer your live questions. So first off, Wendy, will you take this one?
We will use our benchmark information that I shared with you earlier to make sure that if we need to postpone or pause our starting dates, that we will be doing that in a data-driven way. And then this is going to happen ongoing. There's not a date that we do a kind of summative assessment of how things are going. We're going to constantly be measuring what's happening and whether we need to take a pause. And that's going to be a daily, truly on a daily basis. And as I shared, the benchmarks that we've created are the criteria that we'll use. And Sam and I will work together, consulting with all of the stakeholder groups, but ultimately Sam and I carry this out and work with the board, who is accountable for the decisions that we make around distance of virtual learning and in-person learning. And then we will be sharing every week with families our safety data. So when we run our reports around compliance with masks and social distancing, with any COVID cases, with anything like that, we're going to share that in a real-time way with families so you can see how things are going. And if we have to take a pause, we'll share that the minute that the decision is made, because we know that people will have to do hard things in their lives if they're engaging in in-person learning, if they have to take a break from that. So we want to give people enough time, as much as possible, to be able to respond.
Absolutely. Thanks, Wendy. And then just since this question is how and when will we know if the open date on the 8th needs to be paused going forward, I just want to remind folks who might just be tuning in of this slide that you shared earlier. And to reiterate that as Wendy and I are working with different groups to revise, refine, and I suppose garner and build support around documents like this one that we're projecting on the screen right now, that these baselines that we would use for possibly pausing in-person learning, Wendy and I and Jean talked today, we're clear that we review these every day. So if one of these arrives between now and March 7th, we would email all families right away and say, because our baseline has been activated and we aren't meeting it as a society or as a local community, we'll be taking a pause until we meet that baseline. And so in some of these areas, the Department of Health guidance or the regional community spread would be external factors. And then for sections 3 and 4 here, you can see that school site and local health data, as well as mitigation assessment are important on campus.
Well, and I'll piggyback on that just briefly. The mitigation assessments, our safety snapshots, we have a very clear plan for if we are finding that a classroom on a day is not meeting our 80% compliance guideline, then we will immediately step in and offer training to the adults, provide an opportunity for a pause in the day and bring the students together as a community to do some reminders around protocols. If we find a second day that happens, we may need to pull the adults out if they're not able to manage the students following our safety guidelines and get them some specialized training. And if that happens a third day, then that classroom may need to go home for a day or so while we pull in some really heavy training for these adults. We take this very seriously. What we're hearing from MDH is that the masks are the #1 most important factor in keeping people safe. And #2, maintaining distancing as much as possible is also extremely important. And we're finding,
Thanks, Wendy.
we're finding compliance with masking in particular really, really easy at the SRC after, everyone has gotten used to it.
Yeah. All right. Let's see, Gina, willing to take this next one?
Yes.
All right, I'll read the questions and you tackle the answers. Questions this week, Jean, first off, will teachers be teaching both in person and at a distance?
Yes, both families and educators centered keeping learning communities together and how we approach the needs of students. The models that keep the communities together do require guides to be with both sets of students.
And so as I ask these, I will just let the community know that there were, I'd say, half a dozen questions in this category and probably 4 or 5 questions in the category that Wendy just answered before. So we did combine some of these. So Jean, how on earth is this realistic for educators to do both?
Well, I have to say that we work with amazing educators, and many of you might know or may not know the level of collaboration that guides and assistants have had has just been astonishing. Individual guides will determine which model is best suited towards their classroom, and it might involve doing more synchronous lesson time. Or it could be that a guide will be giving lessons to virtual learners in the morning while the assistant supports in-person learners, and then switch. So the assistant supports virtual learners in the afternoon and the guide is giving lessons to in-person in the morning. But there is flexibility.
And so,
can I say something related to this? There was a question around. There's a question around privacy. If your student is learning on site and you don't want your student to be live streamed, I would say that almost every educator I know, including my own daughter, who's an elementary Montessori teacher, live streams herself giving the lessons, does not live stream her in-person students to her her virtual learners.
Oh, and I also want to mention that we will have additional support where it is needed, that we know that our virtual learners will need additional touch points throughout the day and someone to get additional support. And so we will have a trained guide that is available to work with the students that are in virtual learning.
And then, Jean, how can families hear directly from teachers and other staff about what they need in order to meet the needs of both virtual and in-person learners, so that families know what they can do to help the educators?
Well, we have a lot of work to do next week, figuring out the details and figuring out how to serve the needs of both groups of learners. We might determine that our virtual learners have a slight shift to the schedule, but we will reach out and let families know how they can best support our work as educators and support both their students and the staff at Great River.
All right. And I will remember that in one of the communications we put out last week, I know that some things that could adjust are the schedule, the daily schedule for virtual learners. And especially in each classroom, there's going to be a different number of students who come in person versus stay in virtual learning. And depending on that, that classroom is going to have some decisions and adjustments to make through next week. So I would expect toward the end of the week, classrooms would give an update to virtual learners and in-person learners about what to expect and how to expect those routines. All right, let's see, Jean or Wendy, will one of you read this one so we get a real sort of bantery dialogue going?
Questions this week. Class size. Are there caps on class sizes to ensure space for social distancing requirements?
Okay, so this one is specific to every school in the whole state. And when the Department of Education and Department of Health back on December 16th, and then throughout January and February have reiterated this, put out their social distance guidelines, it's that 3 feet of social distance between students is a minimum, and 6 feet of social distance between adults is their recommendation for health. And so what we know is that with the minimum 3-foot social distancing recommended, in each of our classrooms, we actually could fit all of our students right now. We also know that some section of students in every classroom is going to be choosing distance learning. So while we are confident that we don't have to cap class sizes in our school right now for our classrooms, it also means that our social distancing will use all of those tools and classroom setups that Jean showed, where if there are fewer students in the classroom, there likely will be more distance. And we are anticipating that this planning that we're doing now is going to be useful even next fall as we enter a year where, even as our society is recovering from a pandemic, it'll be really important, likely in the fall, to still wear masks and still implement a lot of these security and health and safety measures that we've been going for. One of the recommendations also, though, is that we keep students in controlled cohort groups. And that is that if there is a positive COVID case, either in a family or at school, that we have more a very clear and more controlled idea of how to track those cohorts and the contact tracing within those cohorts. And so we will be, as we have successfully been in touch with folks who have been at the SRC throughout the fall and winter, we'll be using the same tools that we've been effectively using this year. All right. Well, I will field these 2 questions too. Jean or Wendy, would you be willing to read them to me in order?
Number 1, do teachers feel good about coming back?
Well, so this is one of those questions that I have heard live, that I have heard typed out, and that I have seen in this survey many times. And to put it succinctly, I'm sure that some teachers do feel good about coming back. I also know that many teachers have really struggled with the difficulties of balancing their love of teaching in their classroom with the real anxiety of working in person as a frontline worker during a pandemic. And I think that as we've talked about during the family forums through the last 4 weeks, really, and so you can go look on a family forums at our school website and look through those, but we talked about risk reduction and harm reduction. We talked about how really polarizing this issue is for families, that some families in the harm reduction model are experiencing a real social and educational isolation right now that is a threat to the health and security of their family or their student, and that other families, the threat of the pandemic and being in public is a more present threat for them. And so both of those families are in the community at school. And we see that, as I've talked about in past surveys, as we look at that, I would identify that our teachers feel similarly tension. There are some teachers who would much rather be in-person learning, in-person instructing, and with students on campus, even amidst the pandemic. And that there are some teachers who have asked for accommodations. I'll speak about that, I think, in response to this next question. And that there are some educators who I think really did struggle with the choices between being with their classroom community and the role that they're in now versus accommodating their need to stay in a virtual learning setup and adjust their role. And so the short answer is, I know that educators feel really good about educating students at Great River School, and I don't assume or move forward with this plan without making very clear for you as families that times are tough, and this decision has been tough for many of us. And in particular for the people who are in person, I know that it has not been an easy decision across the board to return to in-person learning. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, as we answer some of the Q&A questions. But the short answer is, it's not an all one or the other scenario. It's that teachers love the students, love the learning community, and in particular, it's been a difficult decision for many. So I see in this next question, though, probably touching on some of those things that we've done internally to try to give folks some choices. So Wendy or Jean?
Jean, you take a turn.
Sam, how have the needs of BIPOC staff, medically vulnerable staff, and staff of vulnerable dependents been taken into account?
So I want to identify something that is really important as we make decisions. And one is that we are an educational institution. And because we're an educational institution, we have to keep in mind that schools, both for staff and for students, have tended to be places where Black and Indigenous and folks of color have had less positive experiences as staff at institutions across the state, and that students have faced more challenges to getting an equitable education. So with that as a preface, I will identify that we have been internally focusing on how to prioritize choices for BIPOC staff in their work, but also in particular, prioritizing BIPOC staff in the rounds of vaccine distribution that we were able to prioritize lists for. And that thirdly, in terms of supporting BIPOC staff, I know that the listening sessions and the long-term planning of support for staff at Great River School has centered this year on our community partner, Equity Alliance Minnesota, hearing from students and families and staff about what adjustments or changes we can make internally to support staff at school. And on the heels of the last question I answered, there's always room for improvement. And one of the things that I think is serving Great River School best is folks like Wendy and Jean and myself hearing from folks what could improve in our HR department and our ability to take feedback throughout the year and adjust so that people see something they need, they can adjust that. And when I hear a member of the Black or Indigenous or Latinx or Asian American community who is an employee at Great River School speak up about one of their needs, I know that from a policy and decision-making perspective, we keep in mind the idea that we have to work twice as hard or more to make this a positive work experience for folks with non-white identities. In terms of medically vulnerable staff and staff who might not themselves be medically vulnerable, but we have dependents at home that are medically vulnerable, we do have a process where we have asked folks if they need an accommodation to work virtually to make that official request. And then we've been working with individuals who make that request on that request and how they can adjust their role so that their in-person role is filled and they have another role. So for instance, those virtual supports that Jean talked about to support virtual learners are one of the roles that folks who need an accommodation are stepping into as their in-person role is filled in the interim. And then knowing that next fall's school year will likely not be quote unquote normal as we start, anyone who's requested an accommodation will also work with them toward the end of May and beginning of June to anticipate if they're ready or not yet to commit to come back in person the following school year, which is next fall. And if they aren't, then our goal is to work with them to accommodate both their needs and then to make sure that next year's staffing is stable. Now I know, I just want to put a caveat on this answer. I know that I fill a role right now that's a school administrator, and I know that that title is not one that's deeply trusted generally out in the world. And so if you do have questions about what has been available for staff, I recognize that we are a school with a very small community compared to large school districts in our area, and that our school community is not reported on in a tiny local newspaper. But if you want to see the documents that come up at school board meetings or what staff are being shown through our publicly available handbook, you can ask for those things, and I'm happy to provide them. And so I would say a theme, and Jean and Wendy, please speak up if I've missed something or haven't been clear enough. The theme from the inside has been, how do we preserve the ability to meet students' needs and meet our mission and vision as a school? And that includes, for me, how do we center the ability to keep people both respected, employed, and available, and able to meet their needs and request accommodations when they need them. And sometimes there's tension there, and sometimes those things line up really smoothly. What do you think, Jean and Wendy?
That was very thorough. I think we can move to the next.
Okay, I think we can move on. Sounds good. I'm going to stop the screen share and invite folks to, if you do have a question, to put it into the Q&A. I'm going to put Jean and Wendy and I into the gallery. Jean and Wendy, we have 19 Q&As. I am, based on previous experience, going to start with the most recent questions, and then we will move back. Jean and Wendy, when you pull up the Q&A, can you see those questions?
Yes.
Excellent. Good. So we'll scroll all the way to the bottom. We've got, anonymous attendee is on fire tonight, asking so many good questions. Here we go. We're going to start with the bottom. Will lower elementary students have outdoor ed lessons again once they go back in March? Jean, rapid fire. Oh, you're muted. Unmute. We're going to have a free-for-all. Everybody unmute. Excellent. Good. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, yes. So they will be available. Excellent.
They're going to have outdoor ed and art lessons, and a third to be determined other activity.
Right. The schedule and frequency is to be determined at least once a week, and my guess is possibly more. What if we are uncomfortable having our students' classroom being live streamed? This seems like a potential privacy and safety concern. So Wendy, I know you spoke to that momentarily. Do you want to reiterate what you identified is the common practice for teachers?
Common practice is to live stream yourself as a teacher giving a lesson, not to live stream the students attending the lesson in person.
Right. And then I'll reiterate that the live streaming also continues to happen within, for virtual learners, the Schoology setup, the secure Zoom link. So we're not broadcasting this out into the world. And then also, we are not recording these lessons with any students in them. So if we do record them, it's just for students to see the teacher giving them. And that's one of the places where, not to get too graphic, but this kind of device that allows you to move around your recorder becomes a real help for teachers who are working both with live students and with digital interfaces for virtual learners. So, the idea is hopefully a live stream would happen because it's the best way for a teacher to share the classroom experience with a virtual learner, but not be interrupting the privacy or learning environment of the in-person learners. Will glides in classrooms be encouraged and supported in spending a greater than typical amount of time outdoors for learning and building community? Jean Peters, going to you.
Yes, that is a true statement. We love to be outside in general, and now we have even more reasons to be outside. And we're going to spend a lot of time building community, and I'm not speaking just of the in-person learners. We want to make sure that we are building community with the entire classroom.
And earlier in the year, Brent spent a good amount of time preparing in the fall some really great outdoor learning environments where we had at one point, and we can set up actual outdoor classrooms.
Yeah, beautiful. And I also know, Jean, that you have worked with our school social work team and our school psychologist and some other folks to think about a way that community cohesion can be strengthened as we bring some students on site and some are not going to be on site. Is there anything relevant to share now, do you think, about that? Or is that something that folks can just look for next week?
I think you can look for more information next week. We are really looking at how to ease the transition for both of our virtual learners and in-person learners and the ways that we can continue to foster relationships with students that might be in two different places. And so
Yeah.
look for more information. We're also working on, we have lower elementary students who are new to Great River and have not been in the building. And so part of the planning week will be inviting students to come in and to see their classroom or to, meet their guide in person for the first time. So we'll share lots
Yeah.
of information, and we're looking forward to it.
Great. Let's see, Wendy, do you want to answer the temperature checks question or ask it?
I'll do both.
Oh, okay.
Why is GRS no longer going to be doing temperature checks at the door? Isn't this a crucial way of quickly discovering fevers and preventing the spread of illness? So we discovered when we brought more and more students on site for the SRC that we were having clusters of congregating students waiting for their temperature checks as they were entering the building. And this felt very concerning to us. So what we've done instead of that is we're asking families to be very compliant with filling out their health forms in the morning and taking your student's temperature before your student comes to school, and then letting us know if your child is having any symptoms at home.
And so I'll also just chime in and say that we consulted with our school nurse on this practice, also followed the recommendations to prioritize keeping cohorts separate and groups of students separate as much as possible. So when we constructed our school a couple years ago, not anticipating a pandemic, but anticipating the desire to go outside a lot, most classrooms have their very own exterior door. So primarily that's how students will be coming in and out of the building. And then secondly, one of the also deciding factors on the temperature check is that it's still available not only in the classroom, but a teacher through this audit process and through being trained in monitoring COVID symptoms can identify even if a student is lethargic, or if they come in and seem like they need a temperature check, call for it immediately. But a temperature, a fever is not one of the initial symptoms. There are symptoms which we'll talk about, I think, at next week's family forum, to see at home if you're tired or you're a little bit out of breath, or even that loss of taste and smell. Those are things that can be earlier signs of this disease. And so we want everyone to be monitoring at home, and we still check. We just don't send everyone through the same entry point of the school, basically. Also. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks for letting me hang on to that question. I really like to answer it for some reason. Jean, hey, what social supports and in-person connecting sort of opportunities might be made available to lower elementary students, like are available to upper L and adolescent students, such as sports and after-school groups? I pitched this to you, but it might be better for me to answer. Let me know.
I mean, I think perhaps we'd have a similar answer that traditionally our lower elementary students don't participate in sports or after school groups. We are looking and to have some on campus or nearby off campus get-togethers. And so classrooms will have an ability to come together. And we're also looking for perhaps later on in the spring when the weather is nicer to increase the frequency of those opportunities. Sam, you want to add anything?
Yes. Well, I would also add that families have access to, and if you need a reminder, just let us know, phone call us, email us, carrier pigeon us, let us know, because families have access to the family directory. We have it organized also by classroom. And I am asking, on the heels of that question of how can families help educators meet the needs of all these different groups, I am asking families to make small offers to each other in your neighborhoods or your class home cohorts for socially distant outdoor gatherings with each other to build those connections. Educators, we really have our hands full thinking about the school day. And so there have been some social events for older students. Also, I think I'll talk to some PEG folks, especially lower elementary families, to try to get some of those gatherings to happen outside of just the educator planned one. All right, so a three-part lunch question. How will school provided lunch work? Will lunches be eaten outside when possible? And when inside, will windows and doors be opened if possible? Wendy, will you take this one?
I actually, upcoming, I think there is going to be more information to share. I don't want to say anything definitive. I have a
Mhm.
meeting coming up with the kitchen crew about providing
Mhm.
on-site lunches for students. We are working on, the students will not eat in the cafeteria. They'll eat in their classrooms and their cohorts. And when the weather gets nice, just as in, normal times, students will have opportunities to eat outside.
Yeah.
And I think that
Great.
what we want to do is get the planning more solid, and then we'll share more information when we know exactly what it looks like.
Yeah. I'll just give a time check. There's about 10 minutes left, really 9 minutes. Any of you who have to leave right at 7, we will, I believe, stay here and answer all the questions that are currently up on the Q&A board. And then again, this recording will be posted, and then we'll also be sending out a connection to the slideshow that we gave later after 7, in case you have an urgent meeting to get to at 7. All right, here we go. I've got a question about how does the time outdoors, how's that designed into the schedule? What amount of time is there for recess? Jean, I know in a typical week, there's 45 minutes every day for recess. I also know that your teams have to make some final decisions next week about how that's staggered or not and how that works into the schedule. Is it worth saying anything other than that right now?
I think that it's probably best to wait as we see how the schedules are going to look. But I also want to say that recess is just one time that students will be outside. That in a meeting I had with guides today, there was lots of talk of going on walks, and we can give lessons outside. And as soon as the weather is nice, that we'll be eating lunch outside. So stay tuned for more details next week.
Yep. So here I've got one. What is the, will there be an amount of masks required per student per day? And is there a standard for the type of masks and material? Wendy, let's tackle this one together. A student should have a mask on all day.
Correct.
Great. What my answer to this would be is that the Department of Health in Minnesota has often echoed the CDC recommendations in terms of masks. At this point, the Department of Education and Health are making very clear that a mask that fits your student and effectively filters their breathing is much better than trying to get many masks on that don't fit as well. And so we do have masks provided both by the state and that we have purchased this year for PPE for students that are available at school for anyone who doesn't have their own mask. Anything else that you want to add about that,
So
Wendy?
I think that rooted in this question is there had been, so I recall seeing another question in another forum about, will there be times, will the students have, right before lunch, you get a new mask, and right after lunch, you get a new mask. We're not going, that requires lots of mask onning and offing that feels not wise. And so the adults will be paying attention to if a student like sneezes in their mask, or if the mask isn't fitting properly. And we have a huge inventory of lots of different sizes of masks. A
bevy of masks.
Yes, that meet the MDA requirements. And we will always be on the lookout for a student who needs a fresh mask.
All right. And one thing, I've got a couple questions here about lunch and snack time. That would be a one time where the classroom cohort stays together. We emphasize the greatest distancing, and then masks are removed for eating and drinking. But that's the only time through the day where we wouldn't have a mask on. And
adults do not eat at the same time that children eat. Because that's a time when the adults who are, semi more vulnerable to passing the virus along, we wouldn't want them to have masks off at the same time that the students do. Right.
And then we will, when possible, fresh air windows and doors will be open. Also, I'll just reiterate that we have HEPA filters in each learning environment, as well as an ionizing system installed this past fall throughout the whole HVAC system. So that those two as dual air quality improvements. For any rooms that don't have operable windows, which is typical in the kind of building we're in, we are looking into making sure there's operable windows in those environments also, which is really exciting for Jean because she's wanted that for 3 years anyway. Wendy, I think you and I would answer this one the same. Is an earlier start date being considered in light of the governor's position that all schools reopen by March 8th?
No, no, we respect the process that our educators have been going through to plan carefully, and that would be a real pulling the rug out from under the teachers.
Yep, so it continues to be March 8th for lower L, April 12th for upper L, and if you're tuning in for adolescents, tune in tomorrow night. We'll talk a lot about it, but we're following the same kind of processes, timelines, and plans. And so the first step is in surveying the community, just like it has been for here. Will audit data for compliance be provided on our child's individual classroom? Wendy, will you take this one?
That's a good, I am going to defer answering that question. We are definitely, I want to go back and talk to the team about that. But we as a team that's monitoring safety and then responding to any deficits that we're seeing are doing that. Like we're taking that, we are looking classroom to classroom. And it's important to us to be able to do that. I don't know whether we're going to be, whether it's appropriate to share that out publicly.
Right. And I think we'll talk with our classroom teams about that. And specifically, just to let you all know, I know Wendy really illustrated the 80% minimum benchmark, and that if classrooms can't meet that, we're prepared to pause in-person learning for that cohort. That's really our minimum requirement. We have to be at 80% compliance with all of the rules. And then we're working to get to 100 every day. And so I just want to be really clear on that with folks too.
Jean,
what does training?
Let me say one thing. We been doing these snapshots on site with SRC students, and Derek shared some data with us today. Jean, was it
97% compliance on masks?
97. Beautiful. All right. Still, I would say room for improvement. We're still going to work on it. So an anonymous attendee asks, I'm guessing there will not be community snacks in the classrooms. You are correct. We are foregoing that practice due to the pandemic accommodations right now. What will be the official school hours? Saw this in communication but cannot find it. Here's what I do know, just to not pitch this between the three of us. 9 to 3 is the framework we're working with, just like we have been at least since 2021 started, and we made that adjustment for elementary hours to be 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. So that's the framework we're working in. It may be, though, that the teams working with Jean right now in how we deliver the best education to students may adjust the distance learning day slightly before or slightly outside of those 9 to 3 hours. Not necessarily extending them longer, but shifting them so that virtual learners can get the kind of focused interaction and attention, either again, before 9 or possibly after 3. But that again is something that'll be finalized next week. Jean, is there anything else that you think is worth mentioning?
I want to say, Sam, that I really like the tech question, even though it says,
great.
Hi, Sam and Jean, here I'm jumping in. But I like,
please jump in.
I think for the students who are coming back to work in person, there's going to be a bit of an adjustment around, I've been staring at a screen all the time, and we are working with our social workers to come up with a really good plan around how to make going from working virtually to relating with a human being who's giving you lessons in person, and then following up work with your friends around you to make sure the students are getting the support that they need, and that we're following good strategies for their mental health around that. So, the answer is yes. We know that this is going to be an adjustment, and we know that one of the benefits of being back on site is reducing tech.
Right. All right, here we go. Still staying at the bottom and working up. Can families? This is a cheeky question. Maybe you don't feel that way, but I do. Can families see the 97% data at the SRC? We can talk to folks about it, but I want to check with. I believe that we were probably trying out and refining the safety checklist walkthrough. Yeah, and so it might be less exciting than you think to see the hand count on the sheet.
Well, we just have a pie chart. You can see a pie chart.
Yeah.
But we will
Yeah,
start
so
sharing
we'll,
that. We will start sharing that information with families. Once we make sure that the QR codes are all working well and we have a good system where every classroom is getting 4 safety snapshots completed every day.
Yep. So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is give us a little bit of time to figure out how to appropriately share that so that, Derek Dameron's lunch order isn't scrawled on the side of the PDF we post, because you don't need to see that. Let's see. Students in special ed services, how will they be protected by staying in cohorts? Will they stay in cohorts? Would you all like me to answer this one, or you want to take it?
I'd like to hear, Jean, sorry to put you on the spot, but you're the person closest to this planning.
We're going to be following the Minnesota Department of Education guidelines about when special education staff are working with students that are from different cohorts, that they use the recommendation of the social distancing and continue to wear masks. And we are identifying spaces, larger rooms that special education can work on so we can ensure social distancing.
Yep. And just to point out for folks who don't want to go read through the 32-page summary document of the Department of Education guidelines, classroom cohorts are 3-foot minimum. When you take students from different cohorts and you put them into a social work or a special education service, the guidance is at least 6 feet, if not more, and really as big of a space as possible. And so when and if, say, interacting with speech language pathologist or some other meeting could be done virtually, that's possibly an option, but students will be meeting in much larger rooms if they're out of their cohort with much more space between them. And so those are the guidelines to keep them secure and mitigated also. Will masks be worn outside, Wendy?
This is the plan. We have our elementary students at the SRC have kept their masks on at all times, including outdoor time.
Yeah, all right. Here's a good question from Kavanaugh. How much screen time will in-person learners have per day? Jean, will you take this one?
Yes, our goal for in-person learners is to be working in person and not looking at a screen. There might be time during a community meeting when there is a screen there so we can include our virtual learners. But as Wendy had said, even if lessons are being live streamed, that is really about the guide and not the other students in the lesson.
And then I think
go ahead, Wendy. Sorry.
As students settle into in-person learning, and I use the term, I won't use the term, as they get used to pulling away from using devices and technology, once we feel that that's a healthy boundary that we've created, there may be opportunities for students to collaborate on follow-up with lessons between an in-person student looking at a screen where their virtual learning classmate is, because we also care about the mental health of the virtual learners who are perhaps finding it hard to know that a lot of their classmates are back at school.
No. Jean and Wendy, I'm looking at the bottom 7 questions. We have 13 open. I'm gonna, it's like a moment in a video game where the music plays double speed. I'm going to answer these 7 questions with the least syllables possible. And if I miss something, I'm going to ask you two to take notes and correct me. Here we go. Will GRS have transparent mask or face shield for students who need for developmental speech to see people's mouth? When necessary, we do have access to that equipment. Why are families asked to pay for lower elementary after-school opportunity? After-school opportunities that families pay a fee for are after-school care, like Big Canoe. We are working on how cohorting happens at Big Canoe. We will be in touch with very specific information next week about that. If you think you need aftercare after the school day is over, please make sure that's part of the RSVP that you submit or are going to submit. We don't have an after-school lower elementary social opportunity that you pay for right now. What is the protocol if there's a confirmed positive case in a classroom? So we do actually have that protocol written down. At this point, we find who's a close contact of that positive case, and all of those folks immediately go on quarantine. At this point, if it was a typical classroom where everyone's in the room most of the day together, that cohort would take a quarantine while we contact trace and identify for how long that needs to happen. So we are still operating in a pandemic. In-person learners will still have to take a quarantine if they're exposed to positive cases. And historically, we've been extremely successful where positive cases on site this year at the SRC, whether they're among adults or students, have not passed to other people in the building, even though those folks have been in the environment for extended periods of time with a positive case. And so just to identify that we are successful at this, and generally the whole classroom would take a quarantine unless we can really isolate that only a few folks had a close contact with the positive case. So that won't change because of this. Will staff and students be regularly tested for COVID on site? Staff are tested every other week. We will be in touch very soon, alerting families to where in the state of Minnesota anyone can request a free test. And we will likely be asking families to engage in a test before their student comes on site at any age. Some teachers, go ahead, please help me out.
Yeah. We can ask that, but to be clear, we can't mandate that. We're not mandating that people have to take a test.
Thank you, Wendy. In fact, there are some legal limits to what schools can do, also to what employers can do. We offer a COVID test. We can't require anyone to take it. The ask is a request, and we'll be in touch with some specifics about that. But we can't require it. Thank you, Wendy. I'm going to summarize a comment here. It says some teachers may have different feelings about teaching larger classes in person. That is true. And the last part of this question says, could guides and families have an option for the guide to let the families know what their preferences are to help guide a decision to come back in person or not? At this point, we are going to use initial responses from families to build a strategy with in-person learning and virtual learning in that classroom to make that work the best. If a guide is coming across new challenges or new experiences that they think are going to challenge their ability to do a good job, they will work with Jean and figure out a plan to make that work. What is the vaccine rate for GRS staff? Wendy, do you want to take this one on process, or should I try to answer it quick?
Go ahead, quick.
Okay. We are currently asking all staff whether they've been offered a vaccine and if they've obtained a vaccine, though as an employer, we can't require them to report that information to us. So we will be in touch with a willing report of that information, though, to families. Likely next week is when we'll have our first snapshot. Will any students or staff be exempt from mask wearing while being on site learning or educating? To my knowledge, we don't have any employees who need an exemption for mask wearing. And to my knowledge, we don't have any students in the elementary who require an exemption to mask wearing. Jean and Wendy, am I correct there?
You are correct.
Okay, so there are students in the whole school, some of which who've got respiratory conditions or equipment that require breaks from masks. Currently, though, none in the elementary. And then also specifically, there are some students who need to work on mask wearing skills. And so I don't want to give anyone a picture of 100% compliance. We are going to be always improving on compliance, and that's why we've set some of those public standards. Will there be any additional support on the buses to make sure kids are socially distancing? I will answer this one quick also, and it'll be the last quickie, then we'll see what we got left. On the buses, our bus drivers and bus companies will be following the students from different households will be 6 feet apart on the bus. And we are not able to cohort on the buses at this point. So we can't have a different bus for every classroom cohort, which does mean we are working with our bus company to likely have windows open unless it is dangerous. And then to make sure that students are likely in assigned seats once we know everyone that needs to be on buses. There won't be additional staff on the bus in order to do that monitoring of distancing, though our buses do have secure cameras so we can review, if we need to, contact tracing, exposure, and if we're following our guidelines on the bus. Whew, okay. Let's see, Wendy, will you answer this one? Will families who travel out of state for March 1st to 5th grade, do they have to, March 1st to 5th, do they have to quarantine for a week after they return, even though that might delay their start for them?
Yes.
Yes. And so that's going to be the simple answer for the rest of the spring until there's some large announcement nationwide, is that if you travel, and I would add, if you go to a place like a local water park or like a local festival, or you go to a wedding, or you go to an event where you're going to see lots of folks, even if you did the best distancing and masking, we just request that you work with us as a school and a community to follow that 7-day quarantine after that kind of exposure, to keep everybody secure and comfortable. All right. What does training adults look like?
What does training?
I'll get in.
Yeah, well,
I don't jump in. I mean,
Yeah.
we have, that's part of what next week is for. You know, a good part of our planning week will be spending time making sure that everyone is trained in all the different areas of the benchmarks that we're sharing. And then making sure that not only are we trained, and this will, I think, answer another question, that we're also all aware of how we're working with all students, not just students in your own classroom, to also meet all of the safety standards.
Yep. We've also used a template that I've seen commonly among different local chapters of St. Paul Federation of Educators, for instance, or Minnesota Federation of Teachers, checklists for training that are put out by teachers unions that we're using as guidelines for how to meet all those same safety standards as a school. Wendy, anything else you want to say?
Mm-mm.
Okay. We presented we'll be tracking how many students are wearing masks correctly and incorrectly. Does this mean our staff will not be enforcing proper mask wearing while in the building? No, I'll just chime in and say our mask wearing will be enforced and reinforced by staff, and we will also be observing so we can get an idea of success rates, what's going well. So for instance, when we observed 97% success, I'm sure those 3% of students who weren't complying with mask wearing properly were still re-encouraged and redirected to do it properly.
Well, and we have
can you please?
We have formal behavior responses that are a tiered approach to any student who is having continuous and repeated difficulties. And my message is consistently, it takes a village. So if you are an adult who is in the building working with adolescents, and you happen to walk by some elementary students who aren't wearing their masks properly, you are part of the village. So you need to take a moment and say to these students, hello, I'm so-and-so, and I work here at Great River School, and I notice you're not wearing your masks properly. I would like you to fix that. Like, this is a team effort.
Right. So how do we envision distance drop-off and pickup? Jean, you want to field this one?
Sure. We're, again, these are the details we'll be working out next week, but we are looking at an extended drop-off in the morning to try and avoid a rush of students. And we're looking at using more classroom doors. And we will, as we have in the past, have designated spots at the end of the day for classrooms. They won't all be in the same area like they have been in the past. We will spread them out to ensure that kids are staying in their cohorts and socially distanced while waiting to go home.
Nice. Thanks, Jean.
I think there are a couple of good questions toward Jeff's questions. Sam, you might want to.
Yeah. Actually, well, Wendy, could you tee up both the last question in the chat and the last question in the Q&A?
I can try. So is the
okay.
blah, blah, blah. So what is the time frame associated with the form we must finalize tonight? You have to fill it out by 10 p.m. And if you don't fill it out, getting friendly phone calls over the next day or so to get your answer. And there are, for lower elementary students, there are 2 times that you can make a choice to move from distance learning to in-person learning. Jean, say those dates.
April 12th, May 10th. April 12th is the same date as upper elementary. And then both upper and lower elementary families will get another opportunity to move to in-person on May 10th.
So that's
so those are the start dates, and the RSVP dates for those are just 2 weeks before.
Right, because we want to make sure that we're ready.
So the question about, we know that families are looking for in-person learning. We're providing
Yeah.
in-person learning for a number of reasons, because the governor has mandated it, because we are noticing and getting the information around students who are having a lot of harm around trying to engage in virtual learning, which isn't everybody, but there's a
Mhm.
good set of students that this, the harm that they're experiencing is outweighs, keeping them home. And we also, it's a combination of all of those things. So Sam or
Yeah.
Jean.
Well, and then I would identify too that at the heart of this question is, are we providing in-person learning because we believe it's appropriate or because families have requested it? And I would identify that if we truly believed it was inappropriate to be doing in-person learning, we couldn't offer it. We have been following both scientific studies. We are not epidemiologists, but we have been following epidemiologists who speak directly to schools and school operations about this. We've also been following closely the recommendations of the state. And one thing I think you can see is that after, say, governor mandates or government mandates, we did not move as quickly as other schools or school districts to go in person. And in particular, because as I've said in other forums, our learning community is fairly polarized, both staff and families, about this question. And I want to make sure that we still recognize we're a learning community. We have to stay together as much as possible as we move through this, so that we have a learning community when this pandemic is over. So because we see it's appropriate and because we can offer a secure environment, that is why we're offering in-person learning. But this also isn't a campaign for in-person learning at the expense of virtual learners. There was a question, I think, about exactly how much contact time might there be for people in person. I want to identify that generally for virtual learners, we're looking to have similar or the same quality of outcomes as current virtual learning, and possibly the same number of contact points and possibly more meaningful contact points. Seeing the in-person learning happening might be better than what's been happening so far. So I see also a question about what risk level do we assign to the 80% compliance? Is there a fact-based measure of this? I'll report that the Department of Health has been working with school leaders and has identified that that 80% compliance with mitigation measures is a breaking point in terms of the effectiveness of mitigation. So we set that as a baseline so that we can tell both you as a community, internally all of our measures, if we're not hitting an 80% mark, we have to immediately change behavior. And if we're not above an 80% mark consistently, we have to immediately change behavior. Though our goal is an 80%, our baseline is we have to be at 80%. And we would like to be, again, near 100% every day for distancing, mask wearing, hand washing, air quality, and taking care of each other. So,
and that 80%
is there a tight?
Also affirmed by our benchmark committee, which has 2 school nurses as in the membership.
Yep. And then last question, appropriately logistical, is there a tight timeline for drop-off and pickup time frame? Will there be an ability to accommodate that need? I
think Jean answered that.
Yes, I think you did too. And I'll just identify, we are fortunate to have quite a long space logistically for dropping off. And my guess is we will start with some systems. The systems will be effective. And as we learn more, we'll be able to polish those up into more efficient ways to do that also. At this point, we don't envision different times of day for different classrooms. As we learn more about how to drop off or pick up the best, though, we will be in touch with you all. Okay, everybody. This has been 79 minutes of a lot of information. I thank everybody who attended. Jean, thank you. Wendy, thank you. My computer that held up, thank you. The bandwidth. For all of you who patiently stay with us in the first 9 minutes of bandwidth problems, thank you. We will be, again, sharing publicly and publishedly the benchmarks that Wendy talked about next week. But even this slideshow will be available to you all very soon, and this recording will be posted likely on our website tomorrow. Tomorrow night's family forum will be focused with board members present on generally the approach to in-person learning, not only safety standards, but decision-making for the adolescent levels. And if you have questions that weren't answered tonight, please let us know. The dialogue we continue to have is going to keep helping us do the best for our students. And if you're a lower elementary family, we really do want to hear from you by 10 o'clock tonight. So we won't have a telethon. I won't stay online here and just keep talking about it until you fill it out. We threw that idea, I was shot down for that idea long ago, but if you could fill it out by 10 o'clock, that'd be great. And if you just couldn't get to it, we will likely be calling you tomorrow and sending a reminder email. So thank you so much, everybody, and good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye.